Welcome to my channel. Subscribe, listen and enjoy my stories every day. The beginning of my story was as typical as any other. I'm an average guy, living an average life, or so I thought. I'd been with Jenna for 14 years, and while our marriage wasn't perfect, I'd always thought it was solid. We had our routines, our ups and downs, but nothing I would have ever labeled as a problem. Maybe I was naive or just too trusting, but the truth hit me out of the blue, in the most unexpected way. One chilly Friday night, I decided to swing by our local diner. I'd been putting in late hours at work that week, and the thought of unwinding with a warm coffee felt just right. The place was busy but comfortable, familiar faces scattered around booths and tables. It was my usual haunt when I needed a quiet moment. I settled into a booth near the back, next to a row of high-backed seats where it was easy to get lost in your own thoughts, away from the bustle. But that night, I didn't have much time to slip into relaxation. Just a few minutes after sitting down, I heard a voice I knew well, George. My best friend since high school, George was a guy I'd trusted with just about everything. We'd grown up together, gone through rough patches together, even celebrated each other's birthdays every year without fail. As far as I knew, he was as solid as a friend could be. Tonight, though, his voice sounded different. Edgy, like he was trying to impress someone. I leaned back slightly, not intending to eavesdrop, but as his words started to filter through, I was compelled to listen. So, yeah, George was saying with a low chuckle, I've been seeing her since their wedding day. And he has no clue. His voice carried just enough for me to hear the smugness, the confidence in his tone. It didn't take long for my heart to skip a beat as I realized he was talking about me. About my wife. What's he like? The other man asked. I could tell he was a stranger, someone I'd never met before, and that only added to the surreal feeling creeping over me. Clueless, George scoffed, his voice dripping with disdain. He's so wrapped up in his little world that he has no idea what's going on right under his nose. It's honestly laughable. I could practically wave it in his face, and he wouldn't catch on. My mind started spinning. This couldn't be happening. George, my closest friend, and Jenna, how could they betray me like this? I wanted to jump up, to confront him then and there, but something held me back. Maybe it was shock or the paralyzing weight of disbelief, but I stayed frozen, my heart thudding so loudly I could feel it in my fingertips. They kept talking, though I barely registered the words anymore. The world around me seemed to melt away, leaving only a hollow echo of their conversation. At some point, they must have left, but I couldn't even remember how long I sat there, staring blankly at the half-finished coffee in front of me. My entire life, or what I thought was my life, had just been shattered in a single night. That night, I didn't go home right away. I drove aimlessly, not even caring where I was headed. Memories from the past years flashed through my mind, times Jenna and I had spent together, moments that had felt special, that had meant something, or so I thought. And George, the man I'd considered a brother, how long had he been laughing behind my back? I tried to piece together the timeline, to figure out if there had been signs I'd missed, but nothing made sense. Eventually, I pulled over in a deserted parking lot and sat there, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. As anger simmered in my chest, clarity began to seep in, and with it, a sense of purpose. I could have stormed in and confronted Jenna and George right then, but I knew that wouldn't be enough. No, if they were going to play me for a fool, I wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing me break. I was going to take my time, and when I finally confronted them, it would be on my terms. The next morning, I acted as though nothing had happened. Jenna greeted me with her usual smile, her voice sweet as she poured herself a cup of coffee. The deceit was so thick in the air that I could almost taste it, but I kept my face neutral, answering her questions and making small talk. I'd always prided myself on my patience and my ability to keep a cool head under pressure, qualities that had served me well at work and now would serve me in a way I'd never expected. Over the next few weeks, I started taking quiet steps to prepare for what I knew was coming. First, I set up a tracker on her phone. I'd never done anything like it before, and I felt a slight pang of guilt as I enabled the software, but that feeling quickly faded. She'd betrayed me first, and I was only doing what I needed to protect myself. It wasn't long before I started seeing the patterns: Tuesday nights at a certain address, Saturday mornings at a hotel just outside of town. Each ping, each confirmation of her betrayal, hardened my resolve. Then I turned my attention to our finances. Quietly, without a word to Jenna, I started moving assets out of our joint accounts, transferring them to a separate account she didn't know about. I knew I'd need proof of her infidelity if I wanted to make sure she didn't walk away with half of everything I'd worked for. Every step I took was deliberate, calculated, a stark contrast to the blind trust I'd given her and George all these years. The hardest part was playing along, pretending that everything was fine. I had to remind myself constantly that I was in control now, that they wouldn't get away with this. Each time I saw Jenna smile, each time she kissed me goodbye before one of her appointments, the anger flared, but I forced myself to keep calm. My patience would pay off in the end. Finally, after weeks of meticulous preparation, I knew it was time. I'd planned every detail, thought through every possible reaction. Jenna would never see it coming. The house would be mine, the finances secure, and her deceit exposed for what it truly was. And George, well, he'd find out just how unforgiving betrayal can be. I scheduled a meeting with my lawyer, ensuring every legal detail was covered. With the paperwork ready, I returned home that evening with one final task left: serving Jenna the divorce papers. It was the calm before the storm, and as I waited for her to come home, I felt an odd sense of peace, a quiet confidence that had been missing for weeks. When she finally walked through the door, I smiled and asked her to sit down. This time, I wasn't going to stay quiet. When Jenna walked in that evening, I was ready. I'd spent the whole day running through exactly how I'd approach this. Everything had to go just right, from my words to my tone, and I didn't want her to suspect a thing until it was too late. As she entered, she shot me one of those practiced smiles, the kind that would have once melted any tension. But tonight, that smile only served as a reminder of how easily she'd been lying. "Hey, babe," she greeted me casually, setting her bag down by the door. "Dinner smells great. I didn't expect you to cook tonight." I nodded, forcing a smile. "Thought I'd surprise you. Long day at work?" "Oh, you know how it is," she replied, brushing off the question as she made her way to the kitchen. She poured herself a glass of wine, swirling it absent-mindedly as she spoke. "Busy as always. You wouldn't believe the things they've had us doing lately." Her words grated on me, but I kept my voice steady. "Sounds like a lot of pressure. I'm glad you're home. I thought we could talk." The glass paused in her hand, her eyes flickering with a hint of surprise before she quickly masked it. "Talk? About what?" "Us," I replied, keeping my voice calm. "It's been a while since we really sat down and talked about where we're going, what we want." She relaxed visibly, leaning against the counter and sipping her wine. "Yeah, I suppose we haven't. But we're fine, right? I mean, everything's been good." I nodded slowly, studying her. I could see the cracks beginning to show, the faint unease in her eyes. She had no idea what was coming, and part of me almost felt a twisted satisfaction in watching her squirm. "Sure. We're good," I replied, keeping my tone nonchalant. "But sometimes, it feels like we're just existing, you know." She nodded, as if understanding, though I could tell she was slightly distracted. I wondered if she was already planning her next excuse, the next fabricated story she'd tell me about another night out, another fake meeting. I wanted to see just how far she'd take this charade. "So," I continued, pouring myself a glass of water, "is there anything you want to tell me? Anything you feel like we should be open about?" Her gaze dropped to her wine, and she hesitated, but only for a moment. "No, nothing," she said, looking up with a practiced smile that had been honed over years of deceit. "I mean, work's been hectic, sure, but other than that, everything's great." I nodded, letting the silence settle between us for a moment. "That's good to hear. Really good." She took a longer sip of her wine, her eyes searching my face. "Is there something on your mind?" I held her gaze, leaning against the counter as casually as I could manage. "I just thought we'd be more open with each other. You know, no secrets. Because if there's anything, Jenna, I'd rather hear it from you than find out some other way." Her eyes narrowed slightly, her body tensing as if sensing a shift in the atmosphere. "What are you getting at?" I shrugged, pretending to dismiss it. "Nothing in particular. Just that we're adults, right? We've been together a long time. If there's something you need to get off your chest, I'm here to listen. We've always been honest with each other." She chuckled, a little too forced, and took another sip of wine. "Of course we have. You're the one making it sound like there's something to hide." I nodded again, carefully concealing the simmering anger that had been building up. "Well, I think honesty's important," I said, setting down my glass. "Especially after everything we've been through. But, I suppose, if you have nothing to say." Her lips tightened slightly, and for a moment, I saw the mask slip. There was something vulnerable in her eyes, an edge of guilt. But then it was gone, replaced by the casual confidence she'd worn so well all these years. "Look, I don't know what you're implying, but you're acting really weird." I forced a laugh. "Weird? Maybe I'm just paranoid. But you'd tell me if there was anything I should know, right?" "Of course," she replied a little too quickly. She set her wine glass down and moved closer, resting a hand on my shoulder. "There's nothing, I promise. You don't need to worry." Her touch felt cold, empty. It was amazing how someone could stand so close and still feel miles away. I forced myself to smile, nodding as if reassured, even as I felt the betrayal burn deeper. "Good," I said, taking her hand and gently squeezing it. "Because I'd hate for there to be any misunderstandings between us. Misunderstandings can ruin even the strongest marriages." Her gaze flickered, a brief flash of uncertainty crossing her face. "Right," she agreed, trying to match my smile. "So, are we good?" I looked at her, holding her gaze for just a second longer than usual. "Yeah, we're good. I just wanted to make sure we're on the same page." She exhaled, visibly relaxing as she moved to grab her wine glass again. I watched her for a moment, my mind turning over everything I'd learned, every piece of evidence I'd gathered. Soon, she'd understand that I wasn't the fool she thought I was. As she sipped her wine, I shifted the conversation, asking her about work, about her day, pretending as if nothing was wrong. She played along, happy to steer the conversation back to safer ground. She thought she'd gotten away with it, that I'd bought her story, but little did she know, my plans were already set in motion. The following days were a whirlwind of preparations. I filed for divorce quietly, arranging everything with my lawyer to make sure she'd be left with as little as possible. Every day, I came home, greeted her with the same practiced smile, and watched her go through the motions of our life together as if nothing had changed. One night, I found myself alone in the house while Jenna was out. She'd left her phone behind, an unusual slip for her, but a welcome one for me. My hands trembled slightly as I picked it up, scrolling through her messages and emails. I'd already seen enough to know the truth, but I wanted more. I needed that final confirmation, something that would strip away any remaining doubt. The messages were there, as incriminating as ever. Plans with George, whispered promises, even photos exchanged late at night. I felt the anger rise, hot and fierce, but I forced myself to remain calm. This was only reinforcing what I already knew. There was no need to confront her now, the trap was already set. I waited patiently, biding my time, watching as Jenna continued to live her double life. It was amazing how easily she lied, how seamlessly she slipped from one role to the other. I wondered if she'd even feel guilty once everything was laid out before her, or if she'd simply try to spin it, to shift the blame back onto me. But either way, it didn't matter. I was ready. The night finally came when I'd planned to confront her. I'd arranged for George to be there too, knowing that he'd be blindsided. I wanted them both to see just how thoroughly they'd underestimated me. As I waited, I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. I'd done everything I could to protect myself, to ensure that when the dust settled, I'd come out unscathed. When Jenna walked through the door that evening, I greeted her with a smile, knowing that soon, everything would change. That evening, the pieces began to fall into place. Jenna strolled in, late as usual, but I didn't mind waiting. Timing, after all, was everything. I greeted her warmly, hiding my anticipation beneath a familiar smile. Tonight, all the work, the quiet steps, the planning, everything was about to pay off. "Hey, love," I said as she set her things down. "How was your day?" She brushed her hair back, glancing at me in that breezy way of hers, already distracted. "Exhausting," she replied, rolling her eyes. "I need a drink." "Help yourself," I replied, gesturing to the open wine bottle on the counter. She poured herself a glass, barely looking my way, still absorbed in whatever secret world she'd built behind my back. I watched her closely, the way she moved with the same practiced ease she'd used on me for years. There was no guilt in her expression, no remorse. In her mind, she'd managed to keep her secrets safe, a web of lies woven so tightly that she believed I'd never find my way through. I had to admire her confidence, it was almost impressive, in a twisted way. After a few minutes of small talk, I finally said, "Oh, by the way, I invited George over tonight." Jenna's eyes flickered slightly, her grip tightening on the wine glass for a fraction of a second before she caught herself. "George?" she asked, forcing a casual tone. "Yeah, figured it'd be good to catch up, you know. He said he could swing by around 7. She nodded, trying to keep her expression neutral. "Oh, sure. That'll be nice." I could feel her tension rise, see the flicker of worry in her eyes. She thought she had control over this situation, but I'd already flipped the script. George had no idea what he was walking into either, and that made it all the more satisfying. For once, they were both at my mercy, and I was going to savor every moment. When the doorbell rang a little after 7, I let Jenna answer it. She shot me a quick glance, a mixture of forced calm and unease, before heading to the door. I stood back, leaning casually against the counter, watching as she greeted him. "Hey, George," she said, her voice a touch too bright. "Come on in." George walked in, flashing his usual easygoing grin. "Hey, man," he greeted me with a nod, and I returned the gesture, hiding my contempt behind a forced smile. I was more than ready for this confrontation, but for now, I kept my calm. "Thanks for coming over," I said smoothly. "Been a while since we all just sat down together." George laughed, shrugging. "Yeah, it's been busy. You know how it is." "Of course," I replied. "Work's been crazy for me too. It's hard to keep up with everyone's schedules, right?" He chuckled, nodding, and I watched Jenna's eyes dart between us, her nerves showing through the cracks. She probably thought she could smooth things over, that she could keep this secret buried with a few more lies, but tonight was different. As we settled in the living room, I noticed Jenna and George exchanging subtle glances, quiet reassurances that, as far as they knew, I was still in the dark. They had no idea the lengths I'd gone to prepare for this moment, how deeply I'd investigated every detail of their affair, or how thoroughly I'd unraveled their lies. Tonight, I'd show them both that I wasn't the fool they thought I was. After a few minutes of stilted small talk, I decided it was time to take control. "So," I began, fixing my gaze on Jenna, "I've been doing a lot of thinking lately." She glanced at me, trying to play it cool. Oh. About what? Our marriage, I replied, my tone steady. About where we stand. About honesty. Her face faltered for a split second, and George shifted in his seat, his expression uneasy. I could feel the tension thickening, an invisible weight pressing down on the room as they both began to realize this wasn't a casual gathering. See, I continued, looking from Jenna to George, I've been wondering why things felt off. Why you, Jenna, seemed distant. Why George seemed to always be around when you weren't. It just got me thinking. Jenna's smile faded, replaced by a look of dawning horror. She knew, in that instant, that her secret was out, that I was no longer blind to their betrayal. But George, he still looked confused, his face caught between a frown and a forced smile, as though he couldn't believe I'd pieced it together. Is there something you want to say, Jenna? I asked, my voice calm but unyielding. Anything you think I should know? She glanced at George, her face paling, and I could see her struggling to find the right words, to grasp at any thread that might save her from the truth. But there was nothing left to say. Every excuse, every lie had already unraveled. George cleared his throat, his voice unsteady. Look, I don't know what you're talking about. Oh, I think you do, I interrupted, my voice sharper now. In fact, I think you both know exactly what I'm talking about. Don't insult me by pretending otherwise. The room fell into silence, thick with tension. Jenna's gaze dropped to the floor, her hands twisting in her lap. George looked away, guilt etched into his face, his previous confidence crumbling under the weight of his own deceit. You thought I wouldn't find out? I asked, my voice low but steady. You thought I'd just go on, oblivious, while the two of you betrayed me behind my back. Jenna's head snapped up, her eyes wide with fear. It's not what you think. Oh, it's exactly what I think, I cut in, my voice cold. You've been lying to me for years, Jenna. Both of you. And you thought I was too blind, too trusting, to see the truth. George shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Jenna before looking back at me. Listen, man, it was a mistake. A mistake. I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. This wasn't a mistake, George. A mistake is a one-time slip-up. This was a calculated betrayal. Every message, every meeting, every lie you told, it was intentional. You two didn't just stumble into this, you built it, one lie at a time. They were both silent, trapped in the weight of their own guilt, knowing there was no way out. I let the silence linger, letting them sit in the discomfort, the shame. This was the moment I'd been waiting for, the moment I'd prepared for over weeks of quiet suffering. Finally, Jenna spoke, her voice trembling. I'm sorry. I never meant for it to go this far. Oh, I'm sure you didn't, I replied, my tone dripping with sarcasm. But it did, didn't it? And now here we are, sitting in the wreckage of everything you destroyed. George looked at me, his face pale. I don't know what you want me to say. I don't want you to say anything, I replied. I just wanted you to see the consequences of what you've done. Because from here on out, George, things are going to change. They exchanged a panicked look, and I could see the fear in their eyes, the dawning realization that they'd lost all control. I'd held my tongue, let them play their games, but now the tables had turned. I stood, looking down at them, letting the silence settle before speaking again. I've already filed for divorce, I said, directing my gaze at Jenna. And as for you, George, you can find someone else to fix your car and keep you busy. I've already cut ties with you at work, and your income from me. Gone. Effective immediately. George's face went slack, the reality sinking in as he realized the gravity of what he'd lost. Jenna, too, looked devastated, her carefully constructed world crumbling before her eyes. It was a cold, ruthless satisfaction, but after everything they'd put me through, I felt no guilt. Get your things, I said to Jenna, my voice calm but unyielding. You have until the end of the week to move out. She stared at me, her expression shifting from shock to anger. You can't just kick me out like this. I met her gaze, my eyes hard. I can, and I will. You made your choice, Jenna. You chose to betray me. Now you're going to live with the consequences. George looked like he wanted to speak, to argue, but one look at my expression silenced him. He knew there was no point, that there was nothing he could say to change what had happened. I left them there, standing in the wreckage of their lies, and walked out of the room, feeling the weight of years of betrayal finally lifting from my shoulders. For the first time in months, I felt free. In the days that followed, I found myself oddly at peace. Jenna packed up and moved out quietly, her protest simmering down to silence as she realized I wouldn't budge. George, too, slipped out of my life as easily as he'd slipped into Jenna's. The house felt emptier, quieter, but it was a peace I hadn't felt in years. My life was my own again, and I'd shed the weight of betrayal with a finality I hadn't thought possible. One evening, about a week later, I sat in the living room, flipping through paperwork from my lawyer. My divorce proceedings were moving swiftly, my lawyer taking care of every detail. My finances were locked down, my assets safe, and every thread that had connected me to Jenna was severed. Soon, it would be as if she'd never existed. But as I scanned through the documents, my phone buzzed, pulling me from my thoughts. A message, from an unknown number. I glanced at it, expecting some spam or stray text, but the preview caught my eye. We need to talk about Jenna. I froze, dread and curiosity warring within me as I opened the message. The message was brief, unsettlingly so. I know what happened with Jenna and George. I think you should know the truth. Meet me tomorrow at the diner on 5th at 7 p.m. It'll be worth your time. A friend. I stared at the message, suspicion gnawing at me. It could be a prank, or Jenna trying to manipulate me into another confrontation. But a part of me, that tiny whisper of doubt that still lingered, urged me to find out what this stranger knew. I debated it all night, but by the time the sun rose, my mind was made up. I would go. The next evening, I arrived at the diner early, settling into a booth near the back. The hum of conversation filled the room, blending with the clink of silverware and the hiss of the coffee machine. I scanned the crowd, wondering who this mysterious friend could be. As the clock neared 7, I felt a prickle of anxiety. Had I been tricked? Was this some elaborate scheme to get under my skin? But then, a woman walked in. She was dressed simply, with an air of quiet confidence, and she spotted me instantly. As she approached, I felt a strange familiarity about her, though I couldn't place it. She slid into the booth across from me, her expression unreadable. "Thank you for meeting me," she said, her voice calm and steady. I nodded, studying her face. "Who are you?" She sighed, her gaze flickering away briefly. "I'm sorry. I should have introduced myself right away. My name is Mia. I'm George's wife, or rather, his soon-to-be ex-wife." My heart skipped, a mix of shock and confusion rippling through me. George had never mentioned a wife, not once in all the years I'd known him. But there she was, sitting across from me, her gaze unwavering, as if she'd read every thought crossing my mind. "I know this must be confusing," she said, her voice soft but firm. "But I found out about you and Jenna through George's messages. He's been cheating on me for years, and I finally gathered enough proof to confront him. That's when I found out about you." I tried to process what she was saying, the words feeling surreal, almost absurd. "So, you're saying you've known about this, about me?" She nodded. "I've known for a few weeks now. I debated reaching out to you sooner, but I needed to make sure George wasn't watching my every move. He was paranoid, even suspicious of me. But eventually, I decided you deserved to know the truth." "Which is?" I asked, unable to keep the edge out of my voice. She leaned in, lowering her voice. Jenna and George, they didn't just have an affair. They were planning something. A con. The word hit me like a slap. A con? What do you mean? Mia looked around, her expression tense. They were using both of us, taking money from us, bit by bit. I discovered that George had been siphoning money from my accounts for years. But recently, I noticed deposits from another account, your joint account with Jenna. I felt the blood drain from my face. Jenna was taking money from me? Mia nodded. More than just a few withdrawals. They'd set up a shadow account, funneling small amounts regularly. Nothing big enough to notice right away, but over time, it added up. I'm guessing they thought we wouldn't see it. I clenched my fists, struggling to keep my anger in check. So they were planning to leave us, with our money. Exactly. Mia's face hardened, and I saw the same bitterness in her eyes that I felt in my gut. But something changed. Jenna started to have doubts. From what I gathered, George was the driving force. He wanted out, and he wanted a clean break. He told Jenna they could vanish with the money, start over somewhere else. But she started having second thoughts. She didn't want to leave you entirely, just wanted the thrill, the extra cash. I was stunned, each revelation twisting the knife deeper. Jenna hadn't just betrayed me emotionally, she'd taken advantage of me financially, treating our marriage like a bank account to drain. Mia continued, her voice tinged with both sadness and anger. The last messages I found were George trying to convince her to follow through with their plan. He was getting desperate, insisting that she was too weak to leave. I think she finally pulled back, afraid of losing her stability with you. That's when he started looking for ways to get out himself. And when I confronted him, he turned on her, blamed everything on her. I shook my head, numb with disbelief. Why are you telling me this? Mia's expression softened. Because I know the feeling of betrayal. And I thought you deserved to know what was really going on. They used us, took us for fools. But I couldn't just sit by and watch them get away with it. I felt a surge of gratitude, mixed with the bitterness that had taken root inside me since discovering the affair. Thank you, I said quietly. You didn't have to do this. Mia nodded, a faint smile touching her lips. Maybe I didn't. But I think we both needed to know the truth, no matter how painful. I've already filed for divorce, and George is out of my life for good. I plan to go after everything he owes me. I thought you'd want to do the same. I met her gaze, understanding the silent promise between us. We'd both been wronged, used by people we trusted, and though the scars would remain, we weren't powerless. We had our own lives to rebuild, our own justice to seek. As Mia left, I sat in the diner, the weight of the revelations settling over me like a storm. Jenna and George had schemed, manipulated, turned love into currency. But now, their plan had fallen apart, leaving them with nothing and no one to turn to. The next day, I met with my lawyer again, detailing everything Mia had told me. I would take back what was mine, leaving Jenna and George to deal with the fallout of their own choices. They could keep their lies, their empty dreams, but I would have my freedom, and my life, back. And as I left the lawyer's office, stepping into the fresh air, I felt a lightness I hadn't felt in years. The betrayal still stung, but I knew, deep down, that I had the last word.